We haven't done one of these for a while, so let's do a more technical breakdown of Eddie Hall and Brian Shaw training for arm wrestling. First of all, the two of them are obviously massive, and they'll be pitted against the super heavyweights if they do start to compete, which will somewhat negate their advantage through sheer mass. One of the problems trying to train with athletes in much larger weight categories than you is that the sheer difference in size and weight makes it very difficult to do a lot of things as correctly as you would like to do when trying to learn correctly. So someone like Eddie Hall, despite his lack of experience, would probably make quite a good sparring partner for Brian Shaw as they both try to progress through the sport. And since they are both highly experienced strength athletes, a lot of the concepts will come fairly naturally to them, since they're more attuned in general to bodily functions than a non-trained person might be. It's quite interesting then, as we watch them train quote-unquote cupping, that either because of lack of practice or just an excess of sheer brute force, they are actually circumventing almost any actual cupping or wrist flexion and moving the weight through almost pure side pressure with internal rotation. One of the problems that makes this more difficult to avoid is that the cable is coming straight from the side, which immediately forces them to engage side pressure to keep it in place, and then trying to cup on top of that becomes very difficult to do in isolation. So if the goal is only to train cupping strength, a better option could be to either have the cable coming from ahead, so that the body and arm is only pulling backwards to stabilize, and now the wrist is more free to move sideways via its own flexion. This also creates more work for the fingers, since they are having to curl and flex inwards so that the wrist can properly flex. Another option would be to fix the arm in position against something external like a pad or a bench, so the side pressure is negated and only the wrist has to work. For the fun video content, it does not really matter that much, but you can see how if they are not able to properly apply cupping pressure on the table, an opponent who knows how to top roll and bend back their wrist will have quite an easy time doing so, in which case they will have to rely purely on that side pressure. Onto the pronation training. Again, you can see that Brian Shaw is strong, but not quite using the handle as intended. If we look at the chain on the top, it does not ever really wrap across the surface of the handle. What Brian is doing is more like top-loaded side pressure. It could be just that the weight is too much, or he isn't quite experienced enough with isolating pronation, but I think, for most people, especially with a handle like this rotating one, having the resistance coming from a lower angle is going to do a much better job, since on the actual table, pronation and back pressure are almost always working in unison, since they are quite synergistic motions in normal human movement. Another problem with this handle specifically is that it has a tendency to spin either forwards over the knuckles or backwards to sit against the back of the wrist if it is not pulled directly at 90 degrees to the hand. And as the wrist often does with pronation, movements within the wrist through rising or dumping throughout the movement, the spinning of the handle becomes magnified, and very often the challenge is more of holding on in position rather than actually working clean pronation. As they do lower the cable height, we can see that it is still coming too far from the side. While this side-on neutral wrist start is possibly technically the optimal way to start pure pronation with the pronator isolated without any help from the other elbow flexors, it also means it is by far the weakest, since that relatively tiny muscle is now working all by itself. And as we can see, this pronation has become again more like top-loaded side pressure, and we can see again that the handle wants to dump itself against the back of the hand, moving the line of pull behind the midpoint, which pulls the wrist into extension and makes pronation even harder to manage. Onto some table action now. Clearly Brian has a good understanding of the rising mechanics, since his motion here is almost textbook for a rising top roll, which even here with rising by itself is overpowering Eddie's own rising, dumping his wrist and pulling his elbow up off the pad. Again, they're using that handle. While it can be a good handle for rising, you need to factor in how far ahead of the wrist pivot point the load is being applied by it, which is going to magnify whatever weight you have on the cable and make it much more difficult than if you did it with a belt directly over the knuckles. So with these types of movements, especially for beginners, using lighter weights to become accustomed to the motions is almost always going to be more beneficial than immediately loading weight on it to try and strengthen the muscles involved. Remember that most real strength is heavily dependent on skill and neurological mastery of the movement more than the size of the muscles involved. And one of the best exercises, I think, for rising as a skill is simply to do hammer curls with a belt over the front of the knuckles, since rising is still the responsibility of the top wrist flexors and extensors, and is almost always combined with posting or hammer strength on the table, so learning to use everything together will be more beneficial than trying to isolate rising at the wrist for a beginner. Either way, Brian's control of the exercise seems to be perfectly acceptable, probably because he has more practice with it.
But hang on, you've already got the strength.
Yeah.
So it's just teaching it to have that endurance and getting the techniques.
Eddie brings up a good point here, that Brian Shaw already has a lot of strength, so is it not beneficial for him to focus on learning the precise movements rather than trying to strengthen them via pure external load?
Well, for me, I think it's building up the movements, right? So like just this, building up that endurance, and then coming into the strength, right? Because these are all different movements, right?
And Brian responds in turn with another good point, that while learning is important, at some point the load will need to increase for the athlete to keep on improving. And there's really not much more to say after that. You learn and then you get strong, learn some more, get stronger, and repeat until retirement.
Your arm will probably get sore in different areas.
It's like ridiculously, I know that's going to be sore tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but it's different. You haven't done it.
Yeah.
Whereas I built up a tolerance now for this a little bit.
Yeah.
So I could run through this and I won't get too bad.
Yeah.
Again, perfectly on point. One of the main needs for any sport is to train not only the muscles, but all of the connective tissue needs to be transformed into a condition that the load and volume can be tolerated. Which is why you see often people who trained in the gym to be extremely strong through large movements, but then on the table they have not enough conditioning in the right places for the right needs to be able to hold up to arm wrestlers who may be less globally strong but have spent thousands of hours specifically training on the table for exactly that kind of stress.
How long do you reckon you're going to be training this before you go up to some of the top guys like Levan and Devin Lorraine?
Gosh, that's such a hard question, man. I don't know.
How long until Brian can compete with Levan? Realistically, probably never, given that Levan has at least a 15-year head start and isn't significantly smaller than Brian is. But Brian Shaw training with Levan would certainly be excellent content for everybody. In terms of actual real competitions, I think Brian Shaw would be better off for now, competing with mid to high-level athletes who are not as huge as he is. He has the advantage of size and brute strength, but the opponent will have the advantage of experience and technical strength, which would create a much more interesting equation to try and work out. Some potential opponents I think for Brian Shaw would be Schoolboy, Oleg Jok, Yanis Amelins, Frank Lamparelli, Sasha Andreev, maybe even Derek Smith, but for competitive sake there probably should be a bigger difference in height and weight. On to the actual table practice now. We can see right away that Brian is not fluent in pronation, as we predicted from the previous exercises. He has some posting back pressure involved, but from there it's pure uncupped side pressure. And as we said before, since these two have previous insights into strength and movement, Eddie Hall instinctively understands that adding in the lat to drag the elbow backwards is going to be beneficial to opening up the opponent. But unfortunately, pronation and pulling outside do not seem to be quite so instinctive. Otherwise, Eddie Hall would have a very strong top roll set up into Brian's fingers. Instead, Brian goes inside and pushes straight through Eddie's bicep. The next match is actually very interesting. With the lack of deliberate pronation, it goes from a back pressure contest to an open hook battle, in which Brian manages to understand that a press is the ideal opportunity to win with here. And that's it. Clearly Brian Shaw is the most invested and interested in pursuing this seriously, and as he's supposed to be training with Devin Larratt soon, maybe some more of these technical pieces can fall into place and he'll be better able to fully leverage the strength he has in a more specific manner. Who are some of the opponents you think that Brian would be well put against? Let us know down in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. But that's it for now, and I'll see you next time.